If you can afford to live in Idaho or Mississippi, you can probably afford a life in Europe. Of course, there are trade-offs. You might have to cut back on meat or rely on expired groceries if you choose Germany. Or find yourself leaning on food banks just to keep your kids fed in England. This is the current reality in Europe. The French are eating less foie gras and drinking less red wine. Spaniards are stinting on olive oil. It wasn't always like this. In 2000, US and European workers enjoyed economic parity. Today, however, the average European worker is 20% poorer than their American counterpart. If current trends hold, the outlook is even more lopsided. By 2035, the gap in economic output per capita between the US and the EU will be as wide as the gap between Japan and Ecuador today.
So why has Europe fallen so far behind? One of the biggest culprits is a massive innovation drought. There is no doubt that a large part of the US economy's growth is driven by big tech companies. While you'll see a sea of tech giants across the US and China, in Europe, you see only a handful of outliers. European-listed tech firms did not experience any aggregate productivity gain in the last 2 decades, in stark contrast to the 40% growth enjoyed by their American counterparts. Big tech is becoming a rarity in Europe, and the reason is simple: over-regulation. According to former ECB President Mario Draghi, Europe is essentially suffocating its own potential. The EU was the first to jump the gun with the AI Act. While the US builds first and asks questions later, Europe writes the rules before the first line of code is even finished. These regulations fragment the market. Unlike the massive, unified markets of the US and China, Europe remains a patchwork of 27 different digital jurisdictions. The EU now has around 100 tech-focused laws and over 270 regulators active in digital networks across all member states. Young companies are hit with a maze of inconsistent national rules and gold plating, where individual countries add extra layers of local red tape onto EU laws. This creates a massive barrier to entry. While an American startup can scale across 50 states instantly, a European startup gets stuck dealing with 27 sets of lawyers. This fragmentation effectively smothers companies before they can ever reach the size needed to compete globally. Another issue highlighted in the Draghi report is a weak innovation ecosystem. The US and China utilize innovation clusters, high-energy hubs where universities, startups, and investors work side by side to turn lab science into global products. Currently, Europe doesn't have a single cluster in the global top 10. Because researchers are isolated from these business networks, 2/3 of their patents simply sit on a shelf, gathering dust. Without these clusters, Europe's best ideas stay in the lab, instead of becoming the next tech giant. This innovation gap is set to worsen at the current rate, because Europe is facing a massive demographic crisis. As the population ages, the workforce is projected to shrink by about 2 million people every year by 2040. This creates a vicious circle. Younger workers are increasingly leaving to find better opportunities abroad, often in the US or Dubai, partly to avoid the burden of supporting an aging society with stagnant growth. An older society is naturally more risk-averse, which is why we see a static industrial structure that sticks to mature technologies instead of betting on the future. Because funds are being funneled into maintaining the current social model rather than into breakthrough innovation, there are fewer financial incentives left for young entrepreneurs to stay and build the next tech giant at home. The last people to stay in Europe are the entrepreneurs hungry for success and willing to grind. Christian Kallio, a games developer in northern Finland, recently decided to reduce his working week by 1/5 to 30 hours in exchange for a 10% pay cut. Who wouldn't want to work shorter hours? Some might ask, we enjoy a better quality of life and work-life balance than Americans. What's wrong with that? The problem is that as Europe's economic engine stalls, its global influence evaporates. This is a famous 19th century cartoon depicting the scramble for China. showing major world powers deciding China's fate without a Chinese representative at the table. Today, it could easily be Europe on that table, being divided by other nations. In fact, this has already started to happen. In 2025, the US and Russia met at a summit in Alaska to negotiate a peace plan for the war in Ukraine. It was a war fought on European soil, threatening European borders. Yet there wasn't a single European leader in the room. President Trump ignored European calls to pressure Moscow and rolled out the red carpet for his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, at a summit in Alaska in August.
This is not to do with Europe. Europe's not telling me what to do.
Decisions about the future of Europe are now being made by outside powers, while the continent's leaders wait by the phone for the results. The comfortable life Europeans enjoy today is increasingly at the mercy of other nations. The European social model. The 6 weeks of vacation, early retirement, and robust safety nets is beautiful. But we've forgotten the most basic rule of economics. There is no such thing as a free lunch. To maintain their lifestyle, it is time for Europeans to learn to speak the language of power. Europe's economic weaknesses do not trigger dramatic crises, but erode growth quietly, as each new shock nudges us on to a slightly lower trajectory, Lagarde said.